Welcome everybody to episode 17 of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. And today I'm super happy to have with us Kirthi Jayakumar. I hope I pronounced that correctly. From India. She's a peace educator and wears many other hats. And yeah, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Pemba. It's a joy to be here with you.
Same here. So, as a starter, I would like to give us just an idea of who you are, what you do, and maybe also some sources of inspiration that really pushed you or that keep you going.
Thank you for this space to reflect on that. So, I am a lawyer by education. I have
Mhm.
studied law, but I never did anything with that degree. It, in fact,
Yeah,
still stares at me, wondering why I even pursued the degree. But following law school, I began volunteering actively with several nonprofits in India and through the UN volunteering system with organizations outside. And
yeah,
wherever I went, Themba, the one thing I noticed were people were facing multiple layers of discrimination, but
yeah.
one way or the other, that discrimination was gendered. So I was seeing women and non binary people constantly at the receiving end of some degree of oppression.
Yeah.
And all of that made me realize that we can't talk about addressing violence that is overt if we're not addressing the violence that is more covert in the form
Yeah.
of discrimination every day. So I set up my first nonprofit in 2013. It was called the Red Elephant Foundation.
Yeah.
It was a bit naive because the idea was to paint the elephant in the room red so people would
Yeah.
take serious attention of it.
Yeah.
And then started working as a peace educator. And
Mhm.
I did that for about 6 years. And just before COVID started, I closed down the nonprofit because what I realized was the model I had started with in 2013
Yeah.
spoke to a very different world that was spiraling out of control by
Yeah.
2019. And we know what happened in 2020.
Yeah.
So since then, I've also switched gears. I now work in the policy space, focusing on feminist foreign policy, women, peace and security, and decolonial healing justice.
Yeah.
And I guess in a way, what I used to do previously is now fueling my desire to transform the containers that we're working in today.
Yeah.
So that's my story in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you for giving us this overview of a very varied bio. And at this point, I usually just jump into it and ask you this first tough question, namely, what is your understanding of racism? And could you maybe illustrate this understanding a bit?
Well, in a very simple way of saying it, racism is a basis of enacting power by some that have assumed privilege
Hmm.
over some. And the entire dynamic on the basis of which this is exercised is the race that you're born in. Now, it's a very oversimplified definition, but if we
Yeah.
really unpack it a bit, we begin to recognize that there are historical forces that some people have relied on to entitle themselves over some others.
Yeah.
And this entitlement manifests in the form of the policies, in the form of the lands that they took over, the resources that they robbed, the institutions and infrastructures we are working in, and even our interactions with one another.
Mm.
Sometimes we are coming into spaces where our histories are called into attention. And we are dealing with that very real pain and trauma because no justice was ever done for it.
Yeah.
So, I guess my big picture definition here is the enactment of power based on racial lines that privilege some races at the cost of some others.
Okay. And if you kind of look at this in the context of India, I mean, it's huge, over 1 billion people, but maybe there are some examples or some ways that you see it manifest in the subcontinent that you could talk to us about.
So, one of the interesting things about racism, especially in the subcontinent, is that a lot of Indians who go abroad to white majority countries often talk about racism, often talk about receiving racist treatment. I have done this as well. I have talked about racism and I have been at the receiving end of racist treatment. But when we come back home, many of us that have received racist treatment abroad are privileged on our own soil because of
Yeah.
our caste positionality. So, in the subcontinent, while race is one part of the narrative that defines where each of us come from, it is very important for us to acknowledge that caste is foundational to how society is ordered here in India.
Yeah.
and South Asia. So what I mean by the caste system is that society is ordered into categories where some are privileged over others, and it's really just where you're born or what family
Yeah.
you're born into that is now the basis of caste. And it's also one of the most common centers where privilege accumulates. So even if the region has multiple religions, caste exists across religions. So
Yeah.
you could be Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Buddhist or Jain, but you still have a caste.
Yeah.
And that caste gives you some amount of cushion if you're on the upper caste. And it takes away that cushion if you are from a marginalized caste background.
Yeah.
So when we think about racism, how does caste align or fit into it? Two important things. Both are the same levels in terms of intensity as forms of discrimination. They are forms of discrimination against a people for being born into the race or caste that society has ascribed and that society has decided is oppressed or privileged.
Yeah.
And the second thing is the advocacy. Now, in the United States and many parts of the Western world, Black Lives Matter is such a significant movement that's really drawn attention to race, both in the history and the institutions of the West. And so in India, especially, and parts of the subcontinent, you have movements like Dalit Lives Matter, where the Dalit community, which are from a historically oppressed community background, caste background, mobilized across lines to advocate for their rights.
Yeah.
So where you have a Black History Month, you have a Dalit History Month. Where you have a Black Lives Matter, you have a Dalit Lives Matter. So while we're speaking about the difficult side of things, I think it's important to shine a spotlight on the efforts of advocacy as well, that both these groups have been associated.
And you are also active in gender justice. So in this regard, zooming in on the second big issue of sexism, what is your understanding and definition of sexism? Yeah.
So while, again, an oversimplified definition would just look at men and women, I want to zoom further to really recognize that gender and sex are spectrums. So a discrimination of an individual on the basis of their sex and gender identity, where again, one group enjoys privileges that arrive at the cost of the oppression of other groups. But in a grander scheme of things, I would probably say that racism, sexism, casteism, and gender-based discrimination are mutually reinforcing. They are categories of violence that serve each other very well because a very strong demonstration of racist violence is happening right now in Palestine, and reproductive genocide is also unfolding. And so you can see how racism and reproductive genocide are operating. Racism, sexism, and gender-based violence are mutually reinforcing. So none of these forms of violence are in isolation to one. So I think we've got to read both of these together.
Okay. And now to make a bit of a pyramid or a triangle, in my mind, I think of this super hyper complex society which we have, this n-dimensional space, and it has this, let's say, disgusting blobs of racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination. But then, as a kind of positive power field, influence for the good, I like to sometimes think of diversity. And so I'm also curious on that account, what is your understanding? What do you see its benefits and its manifestations in India, present-day society?
Diversity is foundational to our existence. Just think about yourself for a moment. In a day, how many different thoughts do you have? And how many different categories of things do these thoughts relate to? I know in a day, I think about books I want to read. I think about dinosaurs. I think about outer space. I think about pizza toppings and whatever, right? So if there is so much diversity within one person, why can't we acknowledge that there can be that much diversity among a people? We are all agents with free will. We are all people with lived experiences of our own and of our ancestors. And so if we want to homogenize each other, we're losing sight of what that diversity can bring to us. I see diversity as a beautiful way to anchor ourselves in this world where so many different things can thrive together. Because I think about I think about how the food we eat in this moment is a product of so much diversity and travel. I
Yeah.
think about this moment, Themba, with you in this conversation on Zoom. We're cutting across lines and we're talking
Yeah.
to each other about issues that concern us.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a listener from a completely different country and ethnic background who's
Uh,
hopefully gaining something from it, right? In South Asia, diversity has been addressed, I want to say, in very interesting ways. On the
mhm.
one hand, of course, there is the opposition of diversity and a desire for homogenization. And
Yeah.
this, I think, is emerging everywhere where populist right wing leadership is coming up with this
Mhm.
desire to build one identity as most powerful over all others.
Yeah.
But at civil society level, the space for diversity is remarkable. You have so many efforts communities are building to come
Mhm.
together, to work together,
Yeah.
and to see each other in their full reality. So if my oppression and your oppression are bound, let's work together for liberation, as Leela
Yeah.
Watson said. And we're seeing those efforts thrive on ground. Having said that, it's not to mean that people are consistently reflecting on their privilege. We still see that happen
Yeah.
even in spaces where diversity is supposed to be thriving. So
Yeah.
there's always that tension of the opposites, I'd say. Nobody is getting it absolutely right, and there isn't one way to get it absolutely right. So
Mhm.
let's take that pressure off the table. But it's interesting that there are so many different ways to understand and make space for diversity that the world is still waiting to discover.
Okay. Um, so now I'm gonna come to the more difficult part where you'll have to bear with my naivete and lack of super deep understanding, but I'll try anyway, which is kind of trying these, seeing where we can tie these topics to your experience, thinking, expertise, etc. So my you as a peace educator, how can peace education confront the stark realities of racism and sexism? And then what are kind of the upsides of this kind of peace education? And what can be also some maybe of its obstacles?
I want to start by saying that the understanding of peace education is not to preach nonviolence. It's not to say you have to be nonviolent, because
Mhm.
the oppressed groups are the ones that are consistently being forced to be nonviolent, right?
Yeah,
So I want to say that my approach to peace education is more in recognizing our position, the power we have, the
yeah,
privileges we have, and the kind of harms we are cognitively or non cognitively, actively or inactively participating in keeping alive.
hmm,
With that being in place, my desire is with every workshop I go to or I curate for a community, I start by trying to understand what the community wants or needs.
yeah,
What's happening there? Why my assumptions of their reality should not be the basis for the work we do together, but rather what's happening? What are you observing? What are you
yeah,
dealing with? What do you have and want to have more of? What do you not have and want to have? And then we co create the curriculum. So, in that sense, dealing with racism and sexism have always started from the personal to the political and
hmm,
ended with building prioritize repair and harm, where we see ourselves as one part of community. I have a big issue with peace education that is mainstream, which is oftentimes focusing on individual rights,
yeah,
individual liberation. We can never get anywhere if we're focusing on the individual. Our liberation is in the collective.
yeah.
And to be collectively one, we've got to do away with the container that divides us and
Yeah.
think about co creating a container that holds us together.
Okay. Now, zooming it in on you a bit, we touched on this a little bit already, but putting it bluntly, as a person of color in your journeys through the realms of international organizations, What have been your own encounters with different forms of discrimination, and how do you generally deal with it?
Before I get into the answer, I just want to share that it can be triggering for anyone that's listening in. So if it feels right for you to maybe skip this section, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you.
So, of course, of course. So my experience with racism has happened at multiple levels, both as a student when I was in the UK on a Commonwealth scholarship. I was visiting different sites across London with a few of my colleagues and classmates at the time, where a bunch of white British people looked us squarely in the eye. We were all people of color, looked us squarely in the eye and said, "Go back to where you came from." And one of us was actually living in Coventry in the UK at the time. So she said, "Do you want us to go back to Coventry? We could do that. We're just here for the day. We're going to go back anyway." And they were puzzled. They were really puzzled by that moment of response. The other side of my experience with racism has been while in India and working with an organization. So I was working with a US-based organization that was advocating for women's rights for a very short window of time. And this was shortly after India had a massive wave with the pandemic. We had a devastating wave with, I believe it was the Delta virus version or mutation. So I joined work, and the first thing I was asked is, what were the symptoms that all you Indians had? Why was it so special and intense for you Indians? And I'm thinking, where is the empathy? I mean, so many of us have lost loved ones. So many of us are still not at optimal health. And there's a necropolitics at play because my country did not receive the vaccine that your countries all received, to start with. So that was a very shocking reaction to receive on my first day at work. And then at the same place, I noticed when I was just looking through some of the literature they had given me to read about the organization, that my colleagues, I was recruited to be a director level at the organization, and other colleagues were being paid 4 times what I was being paid.
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
And when I asked about different places. And I said to them, it feels both unfair and uncomfortable because I have to be awake in the daytime in my country, and I have to be awake till late hours to take calls with you. So there is a justice metric that you have ignored. And you're also making assumptions about the cost of living in my country. I could have medical needs or health needs or a standard of living that's important to me that I would benefit from having that money. And I'm not doing lesser work for you. And of course, I was called a troublemaker for raising this question because, hold the system accountable and your melanin is the only thing they see, right? So unfortunately, that did not end very well. I left the organization. But I like to think of myself as a bit of a trailblazer because a lot of people left shortly after because it gave them courage to name the oppression that was built into the whiteness of the organization. So I suppose dealing with it at 2 levels individually, I spent time reflecting on myself to see what parts of my behavior are producing this power dynamic for others around me. I have a significant caste privilege here in India that is arriving at the oppression of several people based on their caste. So I think there's a consistent reflection for how I can dismantle my social capital, redistribute it on caste lines so I don't sit with that unearned privilege. And on the other side, a lot of internal work, thanks to the brilliance of people like Prentice Hemphill and Resma Menachem, who've been such profound guides on what it is to heal from racism. And internalize that it's not about you or your value, but about a system that is deeply flawed.
Thank you very much for sharing these difficult episodes and your methods and strategies of dealing with these. So I'm gonna move a bit further afield. In the light of recent discussions on the Israel-Palestine conflict, if one can name it in such a harmless term or euphemistic term, reports have shown increased violence against women in conflict zones. So how can international mechanisms, in your opinion, better address this gendered impact of war?
by saying that we've got to recognize that war is not the only institution that has a gendered impact.
Yeah.
Our entire social structure is ordered on gendered lines, where some lives are given more importance than some others. You either conform to the binary, where your identity as a cishet man comes with a privilege, but also with its own disadvantages, because the patriarchy is also actually dehumanizing men actively, even if they don't want to recognize it. So we've got to recognize those divisions in our society that exist in the absence of war. Now, I say absence of war rather than peacetime because we are not truly at peace. We are living in states that are absent, perhaps military or armed conflict that is overt, but none of us are at peace. So we've got to recognize that container and then see how it feeds into the realities of conflict, where there's an escalation of conflict-related sexual violence on the one hand. There is a change in gender roles where men are often conscripted and women are keeping house, but in more active ways by becoming breadwinner.
Yeah.
And there's also in several families an increase in intimate partner and domestic violence because of the imposition of the war and the destabilization of the family. So I think for us to start by reflecting on what orders our society, what discriminations we are normalizing, what harm we are normalizing at first would be the key step. And when it comes to addressing conflict zones in itself, we've really got to round in on accountability and healing, not just accountability for penal consequences, but also for accountability for healing. And I explain why this is useful. If we're looking at penal consequences, what we've seen in the history of the trial of war criminals is that they end their lives in a prison that takes care of them well. At the same time, the institution of the prison in itself needs to be interrogated because it is a very colonial, violent, capitalistic institution that is often used to target people of color. So our interrogations have to start there, because the idea of prison for the rich and the wealthy and the powerful is drastically different from the way prison is weaponized for people of color and particular identities in different parts of the world. So the focus should be on healing justice. Yes, we've had a survivor. What is the survivor gaining from the perpetrator being put away in prison and kept in a comfortable way? Because we've seen this happen with international criminal tribunals and leaders who are imprisoned in the Netherlands. What is it doing for a survivor who has to spend perhaps the rest of her life dealing with stigma, undoing the psychosocial damage caused by the violence she faced, and potentially facing physical consequences of that violence? So we've got to prioritize healing justice for survivors on the ground rather than to assume that prosecutorial, military industry prison complex justice is the only way to go. I know that this is not particularly a foolproof or a tight answer that will just solve us a way out of it, because we do need a revolution, we do need a social change that takes us away from a world where this level of violence is normalized to a world where this violence is not even a first thought in our minds.
Thank you very much for putting that so clearly. Then, if we are looking at the ongoing crisis a bit further north in Europe, we've seen women of color face these compounded vulnerabilities. And what do you think is the role for gender-sensitive peace policies in addressing this racism in refugee support systems?
Emma, I must honestly confess to you that I am very wary and a bit weary of the ideas of gender-sensitive policies, because the way I've seen them manifest, they're excellent on paper. They seem like they're going to achieve something on paper. And then when we bring them into reality, we bake them into reality, we see that gender is just added into the mix and the mix is stirred up a little. So it looks gendered and then perhaps racially inclusive, and that's about all it is. When in reality, we've got to see how, going back again to the structure and the system, colonialism was very much the brainchild of Europe. Every part of the world that was colonized since is Europe's legacy for the planet. And we see that legacy play out, whether it is in the way they treat women and men of color, because there is also an active demonization of men and non-binary people of color as well. It's not
Yeah.
just the women. We've got to recognize that the continuum of racism enacts itself in multiple ways for different genders.
Mhm.
We've also seen the way in which they continue systems like aid, where the assumption is that only they get to hold the pot of money, and they'll throw that pot of money at each of our countries and think they've achieved something transformative, whether
Yeah.
on gender lines or environment lines. But they've really come in and messed things up even more, so they continue to hold the power.
Yeah.
So it goes really at the root of it all, ultimately goes to a very desperate need for interrogation of ourselves and our positionalities. I think Europe, the United States of America, Canada really need to have a deep, hard look at themselves for the kind of violence they have caused. And that change can honestly, while so many of us are still talking about it,
Yeah.
it is emotional labor on our part to expect them to do, and we're also pushing them to do it. But I think that level of change has to come from within, from their side. They've really got to do better and show up to leave a better legacy. It's a horrid legacy to leave behind when your
Yeah.
only thing is colonialism, the way you've enacted the world.
Thank you very much for clarifying these difficult issues and also laying the finger on who has to have. I mean, all of us have to have a closer look at ourselves, of course, but certain certain agents that maybe haven't done so at all. Now I would like to move on to the part I told you about that might be a bit difficult, problematic, but you tell me if you want to skip. And yeah, you can just give a like a super brief riff on the expressions I throw out.
Okay, let's go for it.
United Nations,
Tired and old.
give peace a chance.
No, get up and work for peace.
Iram Sharmila,
Brave, courageous.
Me Too India,
Introspect deeply at all levels.
migration,
It's normal species behavior across all species in the world.
digital misogyny,
Oh, misogyny everywhere, online, offline. Start with the interrogation offline first.
gender justice,
Very necessary in this moment.
AI,
Oh, goodness, where to begin? Colonial tech, new site for colonial tech.
feminist foreign policy,
Oh, not doing its full potential, still in need of the full transformative potential to be unlocked.
and finally Aruna Roy.
Oh, I love her. I love her.
Thank you very much. That was really great. Thank you.
You, Tempa, this was so much fun. This is so much fun. It's funny that you mentioned Aruna Roy last, because I was hearing her speak last week and I had goosebumps. So it's exciting that I get to say that I love her on a live podcast.
Yeah, and then we already move on to the last bit, and there I was thinking about for you personally, some of your personal practices, be it daily, weekly, yearly, that have had a positive impact on your life. Could you talk about those perhaps?
Definitely. So I want to start with one thing that I learned from my colleagues at We Are Feminist Leaders, Leila Billing and Natalie Brooke, which is the practice of reflexivity, which involves spending time to introspect on the actions you demonstrate, the thoughts that you've had, the way you react to a situation, and even just pieces of information. Reflexivity has pushed me to really work harder and to sort of do better and really kind of show up better. So that's something I really, really credit to the both of them. A second practice is something I learned from one of my closest friends, Vijay Somnath, which is not to get locked up in an echo chamber. Listen to what people are saying outside of your echo chamber, because there's this sense of false validation or a confirmation bias that you get from being locked up in one. And you never engage. You tend to cancel people that are outside of the echo chamber. And that I found was exceptional advice to really reflect on. And another practice is, this is more of an action practice, which again, I learned from another friend of mine, Bhairavi Prakash, which is journaling. You spend time really outsourcing some of your thoughts, because in your brain, you're churning them over and over. So if you externalize it, you're also finding a way to articulate it, even if it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable to name it to a friend. And the final piece is Adrienne Marie Brown's wisdom, which is radical imagination. She speaks about how we are all living in somebody's imagination of what's possible and what's not possible. So why can't we be radical about imagining our futures and our collective spaces? So those are some of the things I like to engage in.
Okay, thank you for giving us a look at this personal toolbox, how to deal with everyday life. And then I was thinking maybe I know today online, YouTube, TikTok, etc. has often a dominance, but I still like to think of the book as an important medium. Maybe some recommendations you can make, that books that you thought were really worth your while.
Absolutely. I would start with Francois Verge's recent book, which is A Decolonial Feminism. This really opened my eyes to recognizing that there's something beyond intersectional feminism, which is being practiced like a buzzword. A second book is Lola Olufemi's Feminism Interrupted, which is a remarkable treatise on how South majority world feminism really is at the forefront and deserves to really be given the space for it to really thrive.
Yeah.
Another book that I have only recently completed is, actually for the third time, is Susan Abul Hawa's Mornings in Jenin, which is a book on Palestine and her story. I don't believe it's entirely her story. It's probably based on her story. I don't know for this for sure, but it's an important book that speaks about the history of Palestine, something that a Palestinian has articulated with a very clear voice, also on the gender dynamic in it all. So that has been a profound read. And I read a lot of graphic novels and children's literature. So I recently came across this adorable graphic novel called The First Cat in Space Ate Pizza.
Yeah.
And it's made me laugh. It's, I think, something I'm turning to for levity in a time where things are just so heavy and difficult.
Yeah.
So those are my 4 reads at this moment.
Saying a bit more, I don't know, in tune with the times, if that is the correct way of putting it, or staying a bit closer to popular media of our times, do you have some recommendations in terms of movies or series which you think, those are really good watches?
Well, I have to confess that my watches are ridiculous because I'm usually the kind of person that watches the same show again and again.
Yeah.
And they're also the kind of shows that make people cringe. So I'm going to take those shows off the public record.
Okay.
But to make a recommendation, I would 100%. The first movie I watched this year is a Tamil movie, and it's called Mayaragan. I could probably spell it out if you want to add it for anybody that wants to follow up, because it's a mouthful. But the movie is so beautifully about male friendships and what it means for men to be soft with each other.
Yeah.
And for me, that was such a beautiful affirmation of radical love in action, revolutionary love in action, because the world is so busy telling cishet men to conform to an idea of masculinity that is violent, when they are being, in the process, divorced from their own emotions and from their full humanity.
Yeah.
This movie was also suggested to me by some of my favorite people, including men themselves, who felt in watching that movie, there was this gentle warmth that they found in their hearts. So I think this kind of fits in with your request for keeping up with the times, because we are in a very hurting planet, and I think this would bring people.
Last one. Are there certain recurring questions, issues, etc., that keep going through your mind, that keep coming back from you, haunting you or pushing you, or just making you curious? Yeah.
3 questions. The first of this is, how can I show up better than I did yesterday for the world? How does this get better? What are we missing in this moment?
Yeah.
And finally, what is the future we want to imagine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kirthi. This is Fantastic. Really great interview. So many new things to think about, so many ideas, experiences, ways of thinking. I haven't considered at all, so I'm very happy we had the opportunity to do this.
Thank you, Themba. It was a joy to be able to reflect with you, and I learned a lot from you as well. Your questions are leaving me with so much to reflect on, so I'm grateful.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful to be in community with you.
Thanks, same here. And yeah, a big thank you to all our viewers across the world, especially today, the ones in India. This should be particularly interesting for you, I hope. Thank you very much. This is really, really great.
And you take care, Themba. Thank you
You
so much, and
too.
we'll be in
Thank
touch.
you.